As a writer, he still has his fastball. Up next on Davidson and Company, Pete Hamill. Hi, I'm Larry Davidson. Welcome to another edition of Davidson and Company. My guest, Pete Hamill, is the author of numerous bestsellers, including Forever and Snow in August, and the memoir, A Drinking Life. Once again, he brings New York City alive with his latest novel, North River. And Pete Hamill, welcome back to the program.
Good to see you.
North River. Give us time and place. And how do you bring North River alive for the readers?
The time is 1934. The beginning of 1934. It starts on New Year's Day. LaGuardia takes office that day as mayor of New York. And the place is the Far West Village, way over, hard by the river, basically, on Horatio Street and the area around that, which is primarily Italian, Irish, some Jewish, a smaller group of Jews, all New Yorkers, and all descended probably from the last great immigration wave, which has been over since before World War I. And the way, trying to bring it alive is the way you bring anything alive. If you're writing about a murder that happens tonight, and you get to the scene, you look for details, and you look for details that will reveal character or reveal something about the person who's lying in front of you on the sidewalk with the cops staring at them. And I think that that kind of detail, which every good writer that I admire knows how to do. If you read Dickens, Dickens reveals London in the 19th century through the details, through the weather, through the fog, through the smell, the senses, through the sound. You know, is there a dog barking somewhere? Is there a radio playing? Is someone singing in the dark somewhere? So I work very hard at the details. And it's one of the reasons when I'm recreating a period in the past that the most useful things to me are bound volumes of newspapers, not the microfilm of the stories, because of the ads.
The ads are terrific.
You can find out how much a pair of shoes was, what a sale was at Robert Hall if you had to buy a cheap pair of pants, how much food was, because the tabloids all had food advertising in them in those days. So I usually, once I know where I want to go in the thing, in the story, I spend a couple of weeks really plunging into that kind of detail. I don't do it while I'm going along unless some scene comes up that I want to research. For example, in this novel, I do John McGraw's funeral. He dies in February. And so I went and got all the clips on that. Who was there? What was the mass like? Was it packed? And pick those details out that can work in a work of fiction, which is always an act of the imagination. So you're reimagining the past at the same time you're trying to be true to it. So it's a complicated thing, but not that complicated.
How about eyewitnesses? People who grew up in that time frame, in that period. Do you talk to them for their memories of what transpired?
If you have them, you know, this is 1934, so almost everybody would be in their 70s. Who was born in that period. I was born in 35 in Brooklyn. But as you know, kids don't remember anything in the first 5 wonderful years of their lives. So you have to find people that live through it consciously. And that's harder and harder to do the longer the time is. But there's all kinds of material around now. Studs Terkel's interviews with people from the Depression, for example.
And they're classic. Oral histories.
Yeah, and it's not, you might find a detail and it triggers something in your own memory, because I grew up with that whole generation that lived through the Depression, starting with my mother and father, but everybody in our building, you know, it takes a village to make a writer. And they were all our instructors, our teachers, telling us how to behave and what to expect out of life, for good or bad. So their presence is in there. But basically, because it's a work of the imagination, the research has to be given time to marinate. You have to put it in the pot and leave it there for a little while and learn how to think about it when you're half awake or half asleep, until it becomes memory. Because novels are come out of memory in their deepest level, and you have to imagine, not as yourself, but as the character you're writing about. And that's a little complicated process. That's why it takes so long, not just simply writing the facts down, but making it marinated into some kind of sauce.
Here's where your process interests me, and I'm going to refer to Arthur Miller, who wrote The Crucible. It really was about, I believe, the McCarthy era.
Right.
In this book, you touch upon issues that I think are even relevant today. I have a small laundry list. I'm going to throw them out, and I'll let you react. Number one on my laundry list, under the rubric of then and now, abuses of power. You address that in this book.
Yeah.
Is that abuse of power an issue that you were thinking about even today, and you interjected it into the book, or is it strictly a process in terms of the narrative?
No, I think what you hope for, what you hope to find are those things, the abuse of power, for example, that persist. They were true then. They were true 100 years before this novel takes place. Right. They were true in Europe through most of its history. And they're true today, too, but the details are different. You know, you're not talking about Guantanamo Bay in a novel set in 1934, although we had a base there. You don't mention it. That's gratuitously trying to make the thing consistent with the present. But it's a theme that if you're writing about a period, one of the things you have to ask yourself is, who controlled this period? Who were the bosses? Who were the people in charge? You look at a city, you say, who owned the city at the time? And that you might not have an answer or an easy one, because you don't want to make some kind of cartoon out of it, that the guys with the silk hats owned the city or something. You don't want to do that. But you ask those questions all the time, I think, if you're writing a novel set in a specific place. I think Faulkner asked them about Mississippi. I think Dickens clearly asked them about England and, to some extent, Paris in one novel. But it's a question that will come up forever because it's a universal thing among human beings.
Here's another universal thing on my laundry list: moral ambiguity and moral relativism.
Yeah.
And you know what I'm thinking of? Because you've got your primary character, Dr. Delaney, is close to, because of the war experience, to a mafia type. And there's a relationship there, and he's not going to give out certain information. And I think about the code going on now in inner city urban America. Don't snitch.
Yeah, there's T-shirts.
There's T-shirts. There are videos. There's a basketball player from one of the Denver teams who's talked about that and did a video in conjunction with that. The Wire, which is terrific on HBO, addresses that.
Yeah, I saw a T-shirt the other day. It said, "If you see a cop, tell a brother." You know, I mean, it's the same thing. It's about snitching, and that was very common to the three major immigrant groups of this period. The Irish would never tell authority because they thought it was illegal. It was the British. Yeah. They thought they were an improper authority in their society. The Italians who came from Sicily did not believe that the Italian government based in Rome or Milan spoke for them. If anything, they were part of the oppression. And the Jews of Eastern Europe were brought up the same way. You didn't collaborate with power because the power was against you to start with. So it was a completely understandable thing that led to these ambiguous things. You know, another novel that I wrote, Snow in August, it turns on the boy not telling the police what he saw. Right. And the rabbi's trying to sort it out and sort out the difference between informing and being a witness, which is a very tough thing to do. If you don't tell anybody what Hitler's doing...
It's a conundrum.
Yeah, it's very difficult to deal with, and it's as fresh today as it was in those days.
You mentioned...
And him, of course,
right.
My guy, Dr. Delaney, is friends with a guy that he was in the Army with, who saved his life as he saved Eddie Corso's life. And he was a bootlegger, which was a completely acceptable violation of the law, because the law was the stupidest law in American history, created the mob. So there was not the same ugliness associated with the mob that happened later when drugs and all the rest of it came in. They were romantic figures to some extent, as witnessed the Great Gatsby. Nobody's a more romantic figure in 1920s literature than Gatsby. But it's still, he can't inform on the guy because he's his friend. They were shot at together in the war. They were veterans of something which very few people had experienced. And they were not going to violate that for the rest of their lives.
The last two books that I've read, yours included, World War I plays an important role. The aftermath of World War I, both the physical wounds and the psychological wounds and the men coming back. So I just want you to kind of share your thoughts about that. And we can throw out there, the Civil War, World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam, Iraq. But I wonder if World War I was different, especially in terms of the returning vets and their hopes and their goals, not just for them, but for their children and down the road their grandchildren. Was it different for those people coming out of World War I?
I think so, because if you can trust everything that was written about the war, both the history and the literature, Hemingway and people like that, the guys who did come back, who didn't die in the Ardennes or the Somme or someplace, what they had lost was a belief in abstraction, that there was something glorious about democracy, the war to end all wars, etc. Flags, patriotic music.
George M. Cohan.
George M. Cohan, people singing Over There in the roads of France. They had heard all that. They'd marched off to war gleefully, right down Broadway, to head for Europe, and then they found out what it was really about and what was being asked of them. And they came back, almost all of them disillusioned. The notion that we get that people who actually fought wars as compared to people who ducked them and then talk about them gloriously from the safety of well-defended lives, the people that fought them came back to this country and didn't talk about it. And that experience was common to a lot of guys, including the people who fought in a war that was necessary to fight, the war against Hitler and Tojo. And they fought in that one, and they came back, because I knew a lot of them as a boy. They didn't want to talk about the war. They weren't going to talk about some glorious thing that they saw in John Wayne movies.
Well, it wasn't glorious.
It wasn't glorious.
It was mayhem.
And a lot of it was chaos and horror. There were heroes, absolutely, in the best sense of the word. But they didn't go standing on street corners bragging. If they stood there bragging about what heroes they were, people would laugh at them. That never happened. And I think it's true of the guys in my book and true of everybody in that generation in particular. You don't hear people today bragging about Vietnam or Korea or even World War II, the few people that are left from what Brokaw called the greatest generation. You don't hear that.
So why do our politicians wear their war record on their sleeve? And maybe I'm not being fair. John McCain, God bless him, he was in a prison camp for many years. Kerry, but they all wear that on their sleeve. I served I did this, I did that, going back to JFK. It's out there as part of their
Yeah.
public record.
I think those particular guys did it because so few people served in that war. If you looked at the Republicans or the Democrats lining up for these debates where they look like guys in a RICO indictment, you look at them, hardly any of them ever got shot at. McCain even was not in combat on the ground, but he gave up 6 years of his youth in a prison camp where he was tortured. Of all the people who were able to talk about Guantanamo, he has the most right because he was tortured. He confessed under torture to things he didn't do. So he knows how useless torture can be as an instrument. And everybody else, as kids, all we heard was the Nazis were torturers. We weren't tortured. We didn't do that stuff. And so I think they have a right to remind people who were not there that there was such a thing as a war that you actually served in. Dick Cheney takes 5 deferments and comes on like the greatest tough guy in the history of the United States. He didn't go to the one that so many other guys went to.
Well, George Bush didn't check the box off to go to Vietnam either.
Yeah,
When
that's
he was
what I
in
mean.
the National Guard. He didn't either.
That's what I mean. Now, I didn't mind that. It was a very war full of all kinds of ambiguities. But if you ducked it, you shouldn't come back 30 years later and talk about how heroic you are now, sending boys off to face guns.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit because you mentioned snow in August. And I think sometimes where you write is as interesting as what you write. And I think of Charles Bukowski. I wonder where he wrote his books. And Hunter Thompson. I can go up and down the list. I'm sure you think about Dickens and when he wrote.
Yeah.
Where did you, I just found this out, but for my audience, where did you write Snow in August?
I wrote it in 2 places. I wrote part of it at the Chelsea Hotel.
That's what I read.
And I wrote part of it in Mexico. I always say between the consonants of New York and the vowels of Mexico, I can get a decent sentence out of myself every once in a while. And I'm on fiction, journalism I can write in a double-parked car because the concentration and the immediacy of it carries you. But works of imagination, you really do need to get some kind of isolation. At least I do, you know. And both of those places, I've loved the Chelsea. I love it still. In my new novel, I have a character who lives there, the one I'm writing. And Mexico, because I've been going there for 50 years, I'm very comfortable there. I don't feel like I have to write about it to understand it. I've been going there since 1956. I went there on the GI Bill. So I think every writer has to find the place where he's comfortable. You know, that his imagination and preferably bored. You know, good boring places make for good novels because you entertain yourself in the stuff you're writing.
We're a nation of immigrants. Obviously, we all come from either European stock or Africa, whatever, but we're really a nation of, I think we're more Mulligan stew than a melting pot these days because we do kind of stand out.
I like the alloy image.
Yeah. But the immigrant experience, and it's in your book, North River, with the mother of a mafia type, follows the New York Giants.
Yeah.
And your brother Dennis writes about this, and it's dear to your heart, the immigrant experience and how important the Brooklyn Dodgers were to your father in terms of defining him as an American.
Yeah.
Where does that come from, latching on to an American sport and the immigrant experience?
Because I don't think you can understand a place unless you know what its sports are about. If you decided you wanted to live in Italy for the rest of your life, you better learn about football, soccer. You better. Otherwise, you don't know what anybody's talking about. You don't know what the colors of the T-shirts are about. You don't understand. And I think what happened, in my case, my father became an American, not through reading the Federalist Papers or de Tocqueville or anything like that, but by reading the sports pages of the Daily News. Because there's a whole language involved in every sport that you have to learn. You know, in Snow in August, the rabbi's trying to figure it out. And he wants to know, what is a bunt? are all shortstops small?
Well,
Are
there
the
you go.
Cincinnati Reds communists? You have to understand that, and I think Eddie Corse, Frankie Botz's mother, although he's the heavy villain of the piece in certain ways, he's also got a mother who's a crazy Giant fan. So life is not what it looks like when it's presented in cartoon fashion. It's more complicated and more interesting and more fun. So I wanted to have that kind of mixture. And some people never get it, by the way. My mother, to the end of her days, she lived to be 87.
Never got baseball?
Couldn't get baseball any more than I could get cricket if I moved to London tomorrow.
Here's where I laughed and I was appreciative of this book because we did an interview with Forever. Great character, Cormac O'Connor. I love cameos because if people haven't read your books, it's not going to mean a whole lot. But if people have read your book, they're going to say, that Pete Hamill, he's having fun with us because Cormac is back again. And he's a great character. So kind of just set this up for us. You touched upon the funeral, but everybody came to this funeral of McGraw.
Yeah, he's in St. Patrick's, and everybody. Will Rogers comes, and John McCormick, the tenor, and all that. And he's there with Rose, the woman who he's discovered, and the little boy is there, infinitely bored. And he looks around to see who's there. He's just curious who's everywhere. And he looks around, and there about 4 rows back he says, I know this guy. He looks exactly the same. I haven't seen him in 10 years. He looks the same now as he did then. Cormac something, whatever it was.
Right.
And then he gets distracted when I think John McCormick walks down the aisle at the moment, and everybody stirs and hustles because he was a big star then. But I what I wanted to, because it's a New York book, that people's lives intersect all the time, in some glancing way. And they're not crucial to each other. They're not even friends, but they bump up against them.
We mentioned North River, North River, North River. North River is what in common parlance?
Well, North River, when the Dutch ran the colony, and they founded it, established all sorts of things for us, starting with tolerance. They had a colony in Delaware. So on their maps, there were 2 rivers. One was the Hudson, which they called the North River, and the other was the South River, which was the Delaware River. And it stayed North River right up until when I was a young newspaper man. I had an editor one night yell at me, get over to North River, Pier 41, it's a fire, and off I ran. He was still calling it the North River, and I have maps where it says the Hudson or the North River, like a 19th century novel, the killing or a good time was had by all, whatever it was. And it fell out of use sometime in the 60s, and it meant the part of the river from roughly the Battery to what's now the Tappan Zee Bridge, which is not on any of the old maps because it's a new bridge. And I don't know why it fell out of usage. Although still some guys around.
I'm sure the older guys.
Yeah,
you heard it.
The older guys.
You heard it. I don't know if it's allegorical or not, but if I remember, and I read the book Forever a while ago, and in this book, there's something about the flow of water that shows up in terms of fluidity and timelessness. Is that something that you think about in terms of developing a theme or something that interests you? The physical flow of water, but what it really represents in terms of life moving on.
Yeah, and it's not original to me. I mean, rivers have been used over the centuries as kind of metaphors for life because they're constantly moving, staying the same, depending on where you're looking at. It's still the river, but it's moving.
Also in Irish folklore, where the beast comes out of the water and takes a human form.
Yeah, exactly. And also the thing, when you have a river as wide as the Hudson, there's like streams within it, that you can see sometimes. Sometimes when tide's coming in, the Hudson, at the North River part of the Hudson, has an uptown channel and a downtown channel. It's moving in both directions at the same time, which affects things you never think about. It affects the life under the surface of fish and oysters in the old days. And also, a novel is like that in the sense that there's various streams that can move through a novel. You'd mind in this novel the use of popular culture, Fred Astaire, the consolations of the movies and all that is one of them that culminates at Roseland near the end of the book. But that can be a part of a wider thing, a larger thing. And it's very much like life itself. You know, you'd like to stop the world and get off, as somebody once said. But you can't. It's moving. It's taking you to wherever you're going to end up. And you ought to trust it and enjoy the water, too.
About 2.5 minutes left. You wrote an essay in this book, Metropolitan Found, the 25th anniversary of New Yorker's book Country No Longer Exists. And you mentioned one of the classic books to maybe read again is Don Quixote. Why Don Quixote?
Well, it's really the first real novel. And it's a novel that tells a funny story, a sad story at the same time, has great characters that you'll remember the rest of your life, the Don and Sancho Panza, makes fun of cheap fiction, of popular romantic fiction, and at the same time says it has value too, you know. And when I read it, I thought, Don, don't listen to these people. If you think they're dragons, they're dragons. They're not windmills, they're dragons. Enjoy it. And there's a sense in that book of wonder at the face of the world, and also of a sense of surprise and having at least the ambition to be a noble person, even if it's not realized.
Last question, just about a minute. We had this discussion before, and I asked you, who do you think would write the great novel about 9/11/01? You mentioned Tom Kelly, who was a terrific writer, Empire Rising, about the building, Empire State Building. Have you seen, read, or thought about, will there be a great novel centered around 9/11/01?
I'm less confident now than I was then, because we've already had movies about it. Movies tend to debase the actualness of real events. And there's way, I used it in Forever as one element of many, because I couldn't avoid it. But it seems to me that we're not even going to know the meaning of it for another 20, 30 years. We don't know where the world is going right now, with religious crackpots on all hands, where little boys cheering because Iraq won a soccer game or blown to bits by some crackpot. You say, we don't know yet. And all of that is connected to September 11th. So I think there'll be many, the way there were many about Pearl Harbor, including James Jones.
Right.
And many more to be written, I think, about this, because we're going to live with it a long time.
At a time, I raised this issue once before with you. Where are we going to see your own autobiography?
Well, I wrote half of it.
You've had such. I can throw names out there from Jacqueline Kennedy, and we've heard these names. But you've gone the cross section of all the people who've intersected in your life. It's got to be a story that should be told.
I have the title, if I ever do, Guilty with an Explanation. But the other part of it is I truly believe in the statute of limitations. So once you start writing about these things, it opens up all sorts of things.
We've reached our own statute of limitations. Pete Hamill, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Larry Davidson. Everyone here at Davidson and Company, thanks for coming, and we'll see you next time.